The morning sun cut through the windows of the C-130 transport plane like a blade. Captain Sarah Mitchell sat in the fold-down canvas seat, her flight suit wrinkled from the long night, watching the other soldiers around her check their weapons and adjust their gear. Most of them didn't look at her. The few who did looked away quickly, their eyes filled with something Sarah had learned to recognize: doubt. She was heading back to Nellie's Air Force Base in Nevada, not because she'd been promoted, not because she'd earned some special assignment. She was being transferred back because her last squadron didn't want her anymore. Sarah stared out the small window at the clouds below. At 32 years old, she'd spent 11 years in the Air Force. 11 years of proving herself. 11 years of being twice as good to be considered half as capable, and it had all fallen apart in what felt like moments. The call sign stuck in her mind. Ugly 6. That's what they'd started calling her at her last assignment, Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington. Ugly. Because when she'd first arrived, one of the senior pilots had joked that having a woman in their squadron was like putting lipstick on a pig, except they'd said it right in front of her, and the name had spread like wildfire through the flight crews. At first, Sarah had tried to laugh it off. That was the military way. You had to have thick skin. You had to understand that pilots were rough around the edges, that they used humor as a shield. But the jokes kept coming. Ugly. That's all they saw when they looked at her. She was qualified, more than qualified. Sarah had logged over 2,000 flight hours. She'd completed advanced combat training. Her scores on the simulator were consistently in the top 10%. But none of that mattered when half the squadron questioned whether a woman belonged in an F-35 cockpit at all. The worst part wasn't the name. It was what came with it, the deliberate exclusion. During mission planning, pilots would gather in the ready room, and conversations would stop when she entered. Maintenance crews would question her flight reports, suggesting she didn't understand what she was seeing. One pilot had actually told her that women were too emotional to handle fighter jets, that they were better suited for transport missions or desk jobs. And the command had done nothing. When Sarah had filed complaints, she was told that she needed to develop a thicker skin, that this kind of thing happened in aviation, that she should focus on her flying instead of worrying about politics. One colonel had actually told her that making a fuss about the call sign would only make things worse for her career. So she'd stopped complaining. She'd kept her head down. She'd flown her missions, maintained her records, and tried to be invisible. For 6 months, she'd endured the cold shoulders and the whispered comments. For 6 months, she'd told herself it would get better. It hadn't. Instead, it had escalated. 3 weeks ago, Sarah had been scheduled to lead a training mission, a routine sortie that required a formation of 4 F-35s to practice coordinated maneuvers. The night before the flight, someone had altered her pre-flight checklist, removing pages that outlined critical safety procedures for her aircraft. It wasn't life-threatening because Sarah always conducted her own independent verification, but the intent was clear. Someone was trying to undermine her competence, trying to set her up to fail. The investigation had been perfunctory. The report concluded that it was likely a clerical error, but Sarah knew better, and everyone knew that Sarah knew better. That's when she'd requested a transfer, when she'd quietly asked her commanding officer to move her somewhere else. The colonel had seemed almost relieved. Within 2 weeks, her transfer had come through, Nellie's Air Force Base, home of the F-35 Lightning II training squadron. They were calling it a reassignment based on her seniority and experience, but they both knew it was a reassignment away. Sarah closed her eyes as the C-130 banked slightly. She thought about her father, Major Richard Mitchell, who'd served 28 years in the Air Force before retiring to their small hometown of Springdale, Arizona. He'd been there when she decided to enlist. He'd been there through officer training. He'd been there for every milestone. But when she'd told him about the call sign, about what was happening at Lewis McChord, he'd gone very quiet. "You could always do something else," he'd said finally, not unkindly, just practically. And that had hurt worse than anything the other pilots had said. Because her own father, a man who dedicated his life to the Air Force, had doubted whether she belonged. The plane hit some turbulence, and Sarah gripped the metal frame of her seat. Around her, the younger soldiers shifted and adjusted. They weren't paying attention to her. She was just another passenger on a military transport, just another body being moved from one place to another. That was fine. Sarah had learned to be invisible. She was good at it now. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that her arrival at Nellie's would change everything. Not because anyone there would suddenly believe in her, But because the next day she would walk into the ready room and hear something that would light a fire inside her that nothing could extinguish. A fire that would ultimately lead to the exposure of a truth that would shake the very foundation of the leadership structure around her. A truth that would force people to see her not as Ugly Six, but as the strongest pilot they'd ever known. But that was tomorrow. Today, Sarah Mitchell was just a passenger on a military transport. She was just a woman heading to a new assignment, carrying all the wounds of the old one. She was a soldier who'd been told in 1,000 different ways that she didn't belong in the sky. Nellis Air Force Base sprawled across the desert like a metallic city. The morning Sarah arrived, the temperature was already 85 degrees, and it wasn't even 8 in the morning. She'd been processed in, quarters assigned, security clearance verified, uniform inspection completed. By noon, she was standing in front of her new commanding officer, Colonel James Hendricks. Hendricks was in his early 50s with gray at his temples and the kind of presence that filled a room. He shook her hand firmly and welcomed her to the F-35 Lightning II training squadron. His words were warm. His smile was genuine. Sarah had learned not to trust these things, but she allowed herself a small measure of hope. "Captain Mitchell," he said, "I've reviewed your record, impressive flight hours, excellent evaluation scores. We're glad to have you." Sarah nodded, uncertain how to respond. In her experience, praise from command usually preceded criticism. "Take the rest of the day to settle in," Hendricks continued. "Tomorrow morning, you'll start evaluations with our training staff. We run things a little differently here at Nellis. I think you'll find the atmosphere more collaborative." More collaborative, code for less hostile, code for maybe things would actually be different here. That evening, Sarah sat in her assigned quarters, a small single room in the officers' quarters, and opened her laptop. She pulled up her email, expecting the usual administrative messages. Instead, she found something unexpected, an invitation to a senior pilot's briefing the next afternoon. Not a training mission briefing, a restricted briefing. The email was marked classified. The subject line read, "Operational Integrity Review Attendance Required." Sarah frowned. She'd just arrived. She wouldn't normally be included in something like this. She sent a reply asking for clarification, but no response came through. The next morning, she completed her evaluation flights. They went smoothly. The instructors seemed impressed with her handling of the aircraft. No one made jokes. No one questioned her competence. In fact, the lead instructor, Major David Chen, had pulled her aside afterward and told her that her instrument control and situational awareness were exceptional. It was a strange feeling, being treated like a pilot instead of a novelty. The briefing was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the officers' club conference room. Sarah arrived early, finding herself alone in the room with a colonel she didn't recognize. He was going through a presentation on his laptop, and he looked up when she entered. "Mitchell," he asked. "Yes, sir." "Colonel Raymond Peterson, Strategic Operations. I'm conducting the review." He gestured to a chair. "Have a seat. We're waiting on a couple more people." Within minutes, 3 other officers arrived. 2 senior captains and a major. They all knew Colonel Peterson. They greeted each other with the easy familiarity of people who'd worked together before. The briefing lasted 40 minutes. It was dense, technical, focused on operational metrics for the F-35 training program at Nellis. Pilot performance data, aircraft maintenance records, training efficacy reports. It was the kind of thing Sarah would have expected from any Air Force installation. What she didn't expect was what happened when Colonel Peterson pulled up a series of emails. "I need to speak with you about some concerns that have been brought to my attention," Peterson said, looking directly at the 2 senior captains. "Specifically, about certain attitudes and practices within this squadron that are outside the bounds of acceptable military conduct." Sarah's chest tightened. This was an investigation, an official review of command conduct. Over the next 30 minutes, Peterson walked through documentation. Complaints filed by female pilots and enlisted personnel, patterns of exclusion, inappropriate comments that had been reported, a culture of intimidation and harassment that had been allowed to persist. And as Peterson spoke, names came up, names Sarah recognized, names of pilots who were still flying, still training the next generation. One name came up repeatedly, Major Thomas Ward. Ward was the senior pilot in the squadron. He was decorated. He had excellent flight records. He was considered one of the best pilots at Nellis. But according to the documentation Peterson was presenting, Ward had also been the architect of a systematic campaign to push women out of the training pipeline. He'd blocked female pilots from desirable assignments. He'd spread rumors about their competence. He'd created a hostile work environment that was technically illegal, morally wrong, and completely documented. Sarah felt her hands shaking as she listened. This wasn't about her. She hadn't made any of these complaints, but hearing the details, hearing how widespread the problem was, something inside her began to shift. The reason I'm including you in this briefing, Captain Mitchell, is that we need to know if you've experienced any of this behavior, Peterson said, turning to her. I understand you were recently transferred from Lewis McCord. I'd like to know if there's a connection to the issues we're investigating here. Sarah's mind raced. She could tell him everything. She could describe the call sign, the altered checklists, the subtle campaign of exclusion. She could add her voice to the chorus of women who'd come forward. But something made her hesitate, something in the way the two senior captains were looking at her with a kind of fear in their eyes. They knew what she was going to say would matter. They knew her testimony would carry weight. I'd prefer to provide a detailed statement in writing, sir, Sarah said carefully. If that's acceptable, I want to be thorough and accurate. Peterson nodded. Absolutely, I'll need it within 48 hours. The briefing ended minutes later. As people filed out of the room, Major Chen caught her eye and gave her a subtle nod. Support, encouragement, it meant more than he probably realized. That night, Sarah sat at her desk and began to write. She wrote about the call sign. She wrote about the hostile environment. She wrote about the altered checklists. She wrote about being told she was too emotional, too incompetent, too much of a distraction. But as she wrote, something else became clear to her. The problem wasn't just at Lewis McCord. The problem was systemic. It was embedded in the culture. And if she was going to speak up, she needed to speak up in a way that mattered, in a way that actually changed things. She typed late into the night, creating a detailed, meticulous account of her experience. And when she was done, she sent it to Colonel Peterson with a note. Sir, I want my statement to be part of the official record, not to seek revenge or compensation, but because what happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else. She hit send and sat back in her chair. Sarah had no idea that her statement would be the final piece Peterson needed. No idea that her detailed account would be what finally gave him the evidence to move beyond concerns to actual charges. And she certainly had no idea that her action would make her a target for people like Major Thomas Ward, people with power, resources, and everything to lose. But tomorrow would bring that revelation. Tomorrow would be when Sarah Mitchell, the quiet passenger, the woman labeled Ugly Six, would learn what it truly meant to fight. 3 days after Sarah submitted her statement, the base was in chaos. Major Thomas Ward had been removed from flight status pending investigation. 2 other senior pilots had been suspended. A full command inquiry had been initiated by Nellie's leadership. And somehow, despite the classification of the investigation, the story had leaked to the news media. By Friday morning, Sarah was reading about herself in the Arizona Republic, quoted anonymously as a female pilot who was transferred from a training squadron in Washington state. The article didn't mention the call sign, but it detailed the hostile environment, the exclusion, and the pattern of behavior that had been documented. Sarah hadn't spoken to any journalists. She'd been careful about that. But someone had decided that the best defense against the investigation was to get ahead of the narrative and control it in the press. And that's when things got ugly. It started with the looks. When Sarah walked into the officers' club for breakfast, the conversation stopped. She could feel the weight of eyes on her back. These weren't hostile eyes, not yet. These were suspicious eyes, questioning eyes, eyes that wondered if she was the one who'd leaked the story. By Saturday evening, the first post appeared on an aviation forum. An anonymous pilot claiming that certain parties at Nellie's were trying to destroy the careers of good men because of political correctness. The post didn't name Sarah, but it described her situation closely enough that anyone reading between the lines would understand. The responses were swift. Some defended the investigation, some attacked it, and some attacked her specifically, calling her a traitor, a liar, a woman trying to use the system to get ahead because she couldn't compete on merit. Sarah tried not to read them. She knew better. But she found herself going back to the forum late at night, reading the words people had written about her, trying to understand how her decision to tell the truth had been transformed into something shameful. Monday morning, she was called into Colonel Hendrick's office. The look on his face told her that something had shifted. "Captain Mitchell, I need to ask you directly. Did you speak with any journalists about the investigation?" "No, sir. I submitted my statement as requested, and I haven't discussed it with anyone outside of official channels." Hendrick sat back in his chair. "Major Ward's attorney is claiming that someone at this base leaked information to the press. He's also suggesting that the timing of your arrival and your statement are suspicious, that perhaps you were brought here to provide testimony as part of a coordinated effort to discredit his career." Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her. "Sir, with respect, that's not what happened. I came to Nellie's as a standard transfer. The investigation was already underway. I provided a truthful statement about my experiences." "I know," Hendricks said quietly, "but perception matters right now, and the perception is that you're at the center of this." What happened over the next 2 weeks was something Sarah would never have anticipated. She became isolated in a new way, not overtly. No one called her names, no one excluded her from briefings, but she existed in a bubble of suspicion. Pilots who'd been friendly would suddenly have prior commitments when she arrived. The maintenance crews who'd seemed welcoming became distant. At the officers' club, people would politely excuse themselves from conversations when she approached. She was being ostracized not because people believed she was incompetent, but because people believed she was a liability, a whistleblower, a woman who'd brought scrutiny down on their unit. And the worst part was the silence. No one wanted to be the person who defended her publicly, because that would make them complicit in her supposed agenda. Sarah maintained her flight schedule. She trained, she studied, she performed her duties with perfect professionalism, but inside something was breaking. Then came the day that changed everything. She was sitting in the ready room, going over mission planning for the afternoon sorties, when Major Chen approached her. He sat down across from her and, without preamble, slid a laptop in her direction. "You need to see this," he said quietly. Sarah looked at the screen. It was a security camera feed from the administration building. The timestamp showed it from 2 weeks earlier, the same day the story had leaked to the press. She watched as Major Ward's attorney, accompanied by a base public affairs officer, walked into Ward's office. The officer had been identified in the investigation file. Sarah recognized him from the briefing. His name was Captain Marcus Holloway. The video continued for 30 seconds. Nothing remarkable happened, just 3 people walking into an office. Then Chen clicked to another file. This one was audio, a recording of a phone conversation. Sarah recognized the voice immediately. It was Holloway, and he was talking to someone at the Arizona Republic, providing details about the investigation. Specific details, names, flight records. "How did you get this?" Sarah whispered. "IT security flagged some unusual phone records," Chen said. "When they investigated, they found that Holloway had been making calls to a reporter for weeks. He's the one who leaked. He was working with Ward's attorney to get the story out there, trying to make it seem like the investigation was politically motivated instead of substantive." Sarah sat back. The betrayal was staggering. A captain in the United States Air Force had deliberately leaked classified information about an ongoing investigation, not to expose corruption or protect people, but to protect his friend, to protect the status quo. "Why are you showing me this?" Sarah asked. Chen glanced around the ready room. No one was paying attention to them, at least not obviously. "Because you deserve to know the truth," Chen said. "And because you need to understand that this isn't about you. You're not the problem. The problem is that when you told the truth, someone with power decided to cover it up." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "That depends on what you do with this information," Chen said. He closed the laptop. "You can turn it over to Colonel Peterson, or you can pretend you never saw it and move forward with your life." Sarah thought about her father's words. You could always do something else. She thought about the women at Lewis McCord. She thought about the pilots and enlisted personnel who'd filed complaints. She thought about the culture that had been allowed to persist because people with power wanted it to persist. "I have to report this," Sarah said finally. Chen nodded. "I thought you might say that." "This will make things worse for you," Sarah said. "You're the one helping me, people will know." "Let them know," Chen said. He stood up. Some of us still believe that doing the right thing matters, that the oath we took meant something. That evening, Sarah met with Colonel Peterson. She handed over the information that Chen had given her. She watched as his expression shifted from concern to anger to something like grim determination. "This changes everything," he said. "This is no longer just about harassment and hostile environment. This is obstruction of justice. This is conspiracy." And just like that, Sarah's private suffering became public scandal. By the next morning, Captain Marcus Holloway had been arrested. His security clearance was revoked. He was being charged with violating the Espionage Act and conspiracy. The news media exploded. Major Ward's attorney went on television claiming that his client was being persecuted. Various military commentators offered their opinions about whether the investigation was justified. And Sarah became the face of it all. The brave whistleblower, according to one news outlet. The woman who destroyed a pilot's career, according to another. She was no longer invisible, but visibility, Sarah was learning, was not the same as safety. The military works at its own pace. Justice, when it comes, arrives slowly and through channels that are difficult to navigate. Sarah had learned this over the course of 6 months. 6 months of investigations and interviews and legal proceedings that ground on like machinery that was never quite designed to move quickly. The investigation into Major Ward's conduct concluded in early summer. The findings were extensive and damning. Beyond the documented harassment, the investigators found evidence of systematic discrimination. Ward had consistently given female pilots less desirable assignments. He'd blocked promotions. He'd created evaluation rubrics that were applied differently to men and women. He'd fostered an environment where female pilots were made to feel unwelcome. In a sane world, these findings would have been straightforward. Clear violation of military code, clear grounds for dismissal. But what happened instead was more complicated, and, in its way, more revealing about the institution itself. Major Ward's legal defense was expensive and comprehensive. He hired civilian attorneys who had successfully defended other military officers in similar cases. Those attorneys filed motions and challenges and demanded depositions. They characterized the investigation as biased. They pointed to the leak to the media as proof that the process had been corrupted by political agendas. And they worked to make Sarah herself the center of the controversy. The defense team filed multiple requests to depose her. They argued that her credibility was essential to the case. They suggested that she had a personal vendetta against Ward. They implied that women making these kinds of complaints had ulterior motives. Sarah had to sit in conference rooms with hostile attorneys who asked her questions designed to trap her. "Captain Mitchell, when you filed your complaint at Lewis McChord, wasn't it true that you'd just been passed over for a particular assignment? Isn't it possible that your complaint was motivated by resentment rather than actual harassment? Captain Mitchell, you transferred to Nellie's very quickly after filing your complaint. Why do you think Major Ward would pursue you across the country when you were no longer even at his base? Captain Mitchell, would you characterize yourself as someone who challenges authority? Would you characterize yourself as someone who holds grudges?" Each question was designed to plant doubt. Each question was designed to make a jury, or in this case, a military panel, wonder if Sarah was a reliable narrator of her own experience. And Sarah discovered something about herself during those depositions. She discovered that she was willing to sit under hostile questioning and tell the truth, even when the truth made her sound like a victim, even when the truth made her sound weak. But she also discovered something else. She discovered that she was stronger than she'd ever realized. In July, Captain Holloway was court-martialed on the leaked charges. He was found guilty and dishonorably discharged. A sentence of 2 years in federal prison followed. But even in his conviction, his defense team argued that he'd been acting under pressure from his superiors, that he'd been following orders, that he was being made a scapegoat for a larger problem in the Air Force culture. Sarah watched the news coverage from her quarters at Nellie's. She listened as analysts debated whether Holloway's actions were indicative of a bigger corruption problem, whether officers at the base had truly conspired to cover up the investigation, whether Sarah herself had played a role in orchestrating the leak to make Ward look worse. The narrative kept shifting, the truth kept getting mudded. But then something unexpected happened. In late August, a file was leaked to the press. This time, the leak was verified and damaging. It contained internal emails from the base command discussing how to manage the public relations fallout from the investigation. More concerning, it contained evidence that Ward had not acted alone. Other senior officers had been complicit. Other senior officers had known about his behavior and done nothing. Sarah didn't leak this file. She learned about it the same way everyone else did, from the news. But she had a good idea who had. She suspected it was someone with access, someone with authority, someone who believed that the truth needed to come out even if it meant damaging their own institution. She suspected it was Colonel Peterson. 3 days after the leak, Colonel James Hendricks was removed from command pending investigation. The official statement said only that certain command decisions require further review. But the subtext was clear. Hendricks had known about Ward's behavior and had done little to stop it. For Sarah, there was no satisfaction in this. There was no moment of vindication, only a kind of sad recognition that the system was deeply broken in ways that couldn't be fixed by removing one person or even several people. But then, in September, came the hearing. It was not a court-martial exactly. It was what the military called a Command Inquiry Board, a special investigation designed to determine whether Major Ward's career in the Air Force should continue. Sarah was called to testify, and this time, it wasn't in a defensive position. This time, she was testifying before a panel of 3 senior officers who had no connection to Nellie's, no prior relationship with Ward, and no investment in protecting the status quo. Sarah sat in the chair across from them and told her story. She described the call sign. She described the hostile environment. She described the altered checklists. She described what it had felt like to be excluded and mocked. And she described it with a clarity and a lack of emotion that somehow made it more powerful. The officers asked her questions, but they were genuinely seeking understanding, not trying to trap her. And when she finished, the senior officer, a 3-star general named Patricia Sherman, looked at her and said something that Sarah would never forget. "Captain Mitchell, I want to thank you for your courage in coming forward and telling your truth, even when it was difficult, even when others tried to discredit you. That kind of integrity is exactly what we need in this Air Force." Simple words, but they landed like a balm on wounds that had been open for months. The board's decision came down 2 weeks later. Major Thomas Ward was found to have engaged in conduct unbecoming an officer. He was dismissed from the United States Air Force, effective immediately. Additionally, he was recommended for further investigation by the Department of Justice for potential violations of federal law regarding discrimination. The statement from the Inquiry Board was clear and unsparing. It identified a systemic failure by the command structure to address known harassment. It criticized the culture that had allowed Ward to operate unchecked, and it praised Captain Sarah Mitchell for her courage in reporting the truth. When Sarah read the statement, she found herself crying, not tears of joy exactly, but tears of relief. Tears of acknowledgement that what had happened to her had mattered, that her testimony had meant something, that the truth eventually had prevailed. But the most important moment came the next day. Sarah was in the hallway outside the training office when she encountered her father. He'd driven from Arizona, an 8-hour drive, without warning. He was standing by the flight briefing board, looking uncertain, looking older than she remembered. "Hi, Dad," Sarah said. He turned, and when he saw her, his face crumpled. He crossed the space between them and pulled her into an embrace. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry for doubting you. I'm sorry for not believing you. I'm sorry for all of it." Sarah hugged her father and realized that this was what redemption actually looked like. Not vindication, not victory, but being believed by the people who mattered most. By October, the news cycle had moved on. There were new scandals, new investigations, new reasons for the public to be outraged at something else. Sarah's story faded from the headlines. The controversy around the Air Force's culture and harassment policies remained. But the intensity, the urgency, the daily media coverage, all of it disappeared. Life at Nellie's returned to something approaching normal. Sarah's flight status remained fully active. She completed her training missions without incident. Her evaluations continued to be excellent. In a way, she was being treated exactly as she'd always wanted to be treated, as a capable pilot. No special accommodation, no pity, just a professional doing her job. But something fundamental had changed. Other female pilots at the base began approaching her. They wanted to talk. They wanted to know what it had taken to stand up. Some of them had complaints of their own that they'd been afraid to voice. Sarah listened. She encouraged them, and she connected them with Colonel Peterson, whose investigation work had expanded to include a full review of harassment across multiple bases. Major Chen remained her friend and supporter. They flew together sometimes, and the easy camaraderie of pilots who respected each other's skill made those missions some of the best Sarah had flown. And one afternoon in late October, Sarah received a summons to Colonel Peterson's office. She walked in uncertain what this was about. Peterson had been rotated to another position. He'd been promoted, actually, which Sarah suspected was because of his handling of the investigation. His office was sparse, nearly empty already. "Captain Mitchell, I wanted to see you before I transferred," he said. "I have something I wanted to give you." He handed her a folder. Inside was her official personnel file, complete with all of her evaluations and commendations. But on top was a single piece of paper. "That's your new call sign," Peterson said. "Official designation. I wanted you to see it before it goes into the system." Sarah looked at the paper, and there, printed in official military format, was her new call sign. "Phoenix." She looked up at Peterson, not quite understanding. "Your old one was given to you by people who wanted to diminish you," Peterson said. "That's not going to happen anymore. Phoenix, because you rose from the ashes, because you became stronger for what you endured. That's the pilot I know. That's who the records will show." Sarah held the paper carefully, as if it might disappear if she held it too loosely. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Thank you," Peterson replied, "for being brave enough to be right when it would have been easier to stay quiet." In November, Sarah was invited to speak at an Air Force Academy function, a symposium on leadership and integrity that was being held at the Academy in Colorado Springs. The invitation came from General Patricia Sherman, the senior officer who'd presided over the inquiry board. Sarah hesitated. Speaking in public about her experience meant reliving it. But she also knew that her story, or at least the telling of her story, mattered. Young officers needed to hear that integrity was possible. Young female officers needed to hear that being underestimated didn't mean being broken. The auditorium was full the day of the symposium. Sarah walked out on stage and looked at the hundreds of faces looking back at her. Most of them were young. Many of them were women. She took a breath and began to speak. "When I first heard the call sign they'd given me, Ugly 6, I thought the problem was with me," she said. "I thought maybe I wasn't strong enough, maybe I wasn't smart enough, maybe I really didn't belong." She paused, letting that sink in. "But the problem was never with me. The problem was with the system that allowed people to tear down someone's confidence because of fear. The problem was with leadership that looked the other way when it would have been easier to see. The problem was with a culture that had learned to celebrate the wrong things." Sarah spoke for 30 minutes. She talked about what it meant to be underestimated. She talked about the cost of speaking up. She talked about what courage actually looked like, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that shows up every day and does the right thing even when no one is watching. And when she finished, the entire auditorium stood up. The applause was loud and long. Afterward, young female officers came up to her. They wanted to shake her hand. They wanted to tell her that her story mattered to them. They wanted to know how she'd found the strength to keep going. Sarah listened to each of them, and she told them the truth. You find the strength because you remember who you are. You remember that your worth isn't determined by what other people think. And you remember that flying, that being in the sky, is worth fighting for. By the following spring, Sarah had been promoted to major. The promotion was based on merit, on her years of service, on her evaluations. But it felt like more than that. It felt like an acknowledgement, like the institution finally saying, "We were wrong. We see you now." Major Thomas Ward's case went to the Department of Justice. Charges of discrimination and retaliation were filed. The case would take years to resolve, and Ward maintained his innocence throughout. But the fact of the charges, the fact that the federal government had become involved, sent a message through the military establishment. The message was, we're watching, we're paying attention, and we're not going to tolerate this anymore. 6 months after her promotion, Sarah stood in the flight suit room at Nellie's, preparing for an early morning training mission. It was routine. It was normal. It was exactly what she'd always wanted, to be treated like any other pilot. One of the younger female pilots approached her. She was new to the base, fresh out of advanced training. She introduced herself nervously and asked if Sarah had any advice. Sarah thought about all the things she could say, all the warnings she could give, all the ways she could prepare this young woman for the discrimination and the doubt and the struggle she might face. Instead, she said this: "Fly your own mission. Don't let anyone else define it for you. And remember that you belong in that cockpit because you're qualified and capable, not because anyone gave you permission to be there." The young pilot nodded, absorbing the advice like it was sacred. That afternoon, Sarah was in the ready room when one of the older pilots, a man who'd been part of the crowd during the worst days, approached her. He was awkward, clearly uncomfortable. "Major Mitchell, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for some of the things that happened. I didn't do anything to stop it. I should have." Sarah could have dismissed him. She could have reminded him of the specific incidents, the jokes he'd laughed at, the times he'd remained silent when he should have spoken. Instead, she said, "Thank you, that means something, and for the future when you see something wrong, say something. That's all any of us can do." His face showed relief and gratitude, and Sarah realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about acknowledging that people could change, that institutions could change, that the future didn't have to repeat the past. As the sun began to set that evening, Sarah walked out to the flight line. Her F-35 sat waiting, gleaming in the golden light. She ran her hand along the fuselage, a ritual she'd done thousands of times, and she thought about the girl who'd wanted to fly so badly that she'd endured everything. Phoenix, her new call sign, was painted on the side of the aircraft just below the cockpit window. It had become real, it had become official, but most importantly, it had become true. The sky stretched out before her, endless and full of possibility, and Sarah climbed into that cockpit knowing that she'd earned her place there, not just as a pilot, but as a woman, as a fighter, as a person who'd been tested and had not been found wanting. Behind her in the control tower, someone was logging her flight, logging her call sign, recording her as Phoenix, not Ugly Six, recording her not as a problem to be managed, but as a pilot to be recognized. And as Sarah pushed the throttle forward and felt the aircraft begin to accelerate down the runway, she understood that this moment, this flight, this truth that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, was the greatest victory of all.